All right, why don't we just go ahead and get started? Thanks, everybody. This is Juliana from the Public Policy Center, and thanks for coming. This is our fourth of our 5 Summer Scholars presentations. Matt Dannenberg is here with us today. He came to the university in 2019. He is an assistant professor in geographical and sustainability sciences, and among other things, studies ecosystem responses to drought and climate change. He was a recipient of our 2020 Summer Scholar program for his project on contributions of anthropogenic global warming to drought-induced loss of vegetation health. That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
So go ahead and take it away, Matt, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions.
All right, sounds good. Can everybody see that screen I'm sharing?
Yep.
Excellent. So hello, everyone. I'm bummed that I didn't get a chance to spend the summer scholarship in residence and get to meet more of you, but hopefully I'll be able to do so once this is all over. Like Juliana said, my name's Matt Dannenberg. I'm an assistant professor in geographical and sustainability sciences. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how anthropogenic warming enhanced the effects of the 2012 to 2015 West Coast drought on vegetation. I want to quickly give a shout out to all of my collaborators and funders on this, though, before I get started. I especially want to thank Bill Smith at University of Arizona and Park Williams at Columbia, both of whom were instrumental in making all this work happen. And then I've also got other collaborators on some of the more recent stuff that I'll present. And then, of course, this was funded by the Public Policy Center, and more recently, some of the work that I've been doing on this same topic has fortunately been funded by NASA starting this past November. So that's good news, and I'm excited about that. I want to quickly, before I start talking about the project, since I haven't met many of you, tell you a little bit about what I do. I'm not actually a policy researcher per se. I'm more of what you might call a global change ecologist. I study how plants and ecosystems respond to anthropogenic changes in the Earth system. And so, of course, there's like a lot of different ways that humans are affecting the global Earth system, especially things like biodiversity loss, increases in anthropogenic nitrogen, and of course, climate change, which is largely what I focus on. And so like this broader field of global change ecology is largely trying to answer the question of how ecological systems respond to and interact with anthropogenic change. And mostly the piece of that I bite off is at this kind of intersection between climate, ecology, and water, all of which, of course, are affected by human activity. I don't really study the human side of things so much, except insofar as those anthropogenic changes affect climate, water resources, and ecology. And so like the big question that I look at in pretty much all of my research is how does past, present, and future hydroclimatic change affect the functioning of Earth's ecosystems? And so in this particular project and in this particular presentation, I'm going to focus especially on how anthropogenic warming enhances the severity of droughts, and especially enhances the losses of vegetation productivity and vegetation health during those droughts. So that's the thing I'm going to mostly focus on, especially the recent 2012 to 2015 West Coast drought, which is the most severe drought on record in that region, at least in the instrumental record, and provides an interesting case study for how warming enhances the effects of those droughts. So I want to start, before we get into that, with like a little bit of theory on how warming is connected to drought and to the water cycle. So this graph is showing the relationship between temperature on the x-axis and saturation vapor pressure on the y-axis. Saturation vapor pressure is basically the amount of water vapor that the atmosphere could hold. So you could kind of think of the atmosphere as like a sponge for water, and a warmer atmosphere is a larger sponge. It can hold more water. And that increase in how much it can hold increases non-linearly with temperature. And so what that means is that even if you hold relative humidity constant, you still get increases in atmospheric demand for moisture. And so I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. So this dashed line would show across this range of temperatures, vapor pressure for an atmosphere with 50% humidity. In other words, this dashed line is 50% of the magnitude of the solid line. Now, what happens when you warm the atmosphere is that the difference between these two, even with a constant humidity, increases. And that difference basically represents a concentration gradient between a saturated surface, your evaporating surface, and the atmosphere. And so what that means is that basically a warmer world has higher demand for moisture, higher demand for water vapor. And so a warmer world increases that concentration gradient between the saturated evaporating surface and the unsaturated atmosphere. Again, even if humidity stays constant. And that difference between those two, the difference between these two lines, between what the atmosphere could hold and what it actually holds, is what we call vapor pressure deficit, or VPD, which I'll come back to a little bit in this talk. But basically, a direct consequence of anthropogenic warming is that difference between saturation vapor pressure and actual vapor pressure is increasing pretty much everywhere where it's warming. So historically, if we look back in the United States at how vapor pressure deficit has changed, we can see that especially in places like the Southwest and the Western US, vapor pressure deficit is increasing pretty much everywhere. That's this column on the left that's showing change in vapor pressure deficit across 4 different seasons: winter, spring, summer, and fall. And that increase in vapor pressure deficit is almost entirely driven by warming. There hasn't been a huge change in humidity, in relative humidity, but there's been a huge change in temperature, and that increase in temperature drives that increase in vapor pressure deficit. So in other words, the atmosphere, when it's warmer, is basically trying to suck more moisture out of the soil and out of the vegetation. And if you spin this forward, looking at how things are likely to play out over the next century or so, I mean, it's pretty much all of the climate projections say unanimously that this vapor pressure deficit is going to continue increasing in the future, again, directly as a consequence of warming. And so what I want to answer now is, like, why is this a problem, and why is it concerning? And there's basically 2 reasons, at least within the context of the work that I'm going to present today, why this increase in vapor pressure deficit is really problematic. The first is that it basically enhances droughts that happen due to natural variability. So most droughts are initiated by just natural variation in precipitation. And there's not a whole lot of, there hasn't been a whole lot of change in precipitation, in total precipitation that's directly attributable to human activity. But what's different is that natural variability in precipitation is being overlain on a warmer climate where the atmosphere is trying to take up more moisture from the land surface. And so even without a change in precipitation, you get increased drought risk, and the droughts that do occur are much more severe. And so here, for example, this is showing, the figure here is showing projections in precipitation on the top, and then projections of soil moisture, both at the surface and in the full soil column, under one climate change scenario. And what I want you to notice is, particularly in North America, there's not a whole lot of change in precipitation that's projected. If anything, there's supposed to be more precipitation coming on the whole. But even with that increase in precipitation or very little change in precipitation, you still get enhanced drought risk or enhanced soil moisture loss just due to that effect that warming has on evaporative demand. So in other words, the precipitation that does come is more likely to get evaporated or used by plants and less likely to stay in the soil. So we have this new type of drought. It's kind of unique type of drought that you could call hot drought. Sometimes it's called global change type drought. Basically, droughts that occur naturally being overlain on that warmer climate. And so if we look at the drought that I'm mostly interested in this work, the 2012 to 2015 drought, what's really remarkable about this drought is that it's just a perfect encapsulation of this hot drought or global change type drought scenario. So this graph is showing precipitation anomalies on the x-axis and then this drought index, PDSI, on the y-axis. And generally what this graph tells you, each point is 1 year in the paleoclimate or observed record. And so obviously when you have higher precipitation, you generally have less drought. When you have less precipitation, you have more drought. The negative indexes on this drought index, that's what you would consider severe drought. What's remarkable about the West Coast drought that happened in 2012 to 2015 is that if you look at the precipitation anomalies, this star is the year 2014. The precipitation anomalies were low, but they weren't outside of the range of natural variability. There were many years where precipitation deficits were actually more severe than that drought. What's remarkable about that drought is the fact that that the temperatures at that time that it occurred were basically record-breaking. And so the precipitation was not lower than historically, than within the range of historical variability, but the temperatures were way above historical variability. And so here we have a case where the drought severity in this region was initiated by low precipitation, but significantly enhanced by those warmer temperatures. And if you look at how much anthropogenic warming contributed to that drought severity, it's something like 10 to 25%. So if you look at just the effects that anthropogenic activity had on temperature and vapor pressure deficit, it enhanced soil moisture loss during that drought by about 10 to 25%, depending on how you go about the attribution to human activity. So again, most of the drought is coming from natural variability, but it's enhanced by that warmer climate. This past year, the Western US has been hit by another really severe drought, and we see the same type of pattern. So this is that same drought index from the US Drought Monitor for August and September. It's basically meant to kind of illustrate how much soil moisture is above or below average. And then below that is the anomaly in vapor pressure deficit, that atmospheric demand for moisture. And if you look at the drought extent, it corresponds really, really closely to where vapor pressure deficit was above normal. And so again, it's a case where we have exceptionally hot temperatures and exceptionally hot vapor pressure deficit, largely driving or enhancing the impact of that drought. Now, the other reason that this increase in vapor pressure deficit is a problem is because plants respond directly to how much moisture the atmosphere is demanding. They respond physiologically to that atmospheric demand. So this is an electron micrograph of the underside of a leaf. And these little pores are called stomata or stomates. And that's the interface between plants and the atmosphere. This is where plants take up CO2 to use in photosynthesis, but at the same time, they lose moisture through those stomates. And when soil moisture is limiting or when atmospheric demand for moisture is high, plants will actually close those stomates to prevent themselves from losing too much water. But in doing so, they also prevent themselves from being able to take up CO2 for photosynthesis. And so there's this direct physiological response of plants to that increase in vapor pressure deficit. So it's concerning both because that increase in temperature and the increase in atmospheric evaporative demand will enhance drought, but in addition to that, it enhances loss of plant photosynthesis. So now I want to get back to that question that I'm looking at in this particular work, which is to figure out how much anthropogenic warming contributed to loss of vegetation health during that drought. We know that anthropogenic activity contributed to about 10 to 25% of the soil moisture loss during the drought. The question is, how much did that translate into vegetation health or productivity? And kind of the hypothesis is that because of that direct physiological response of plants, the impact of anthropogenic warming on plant activity during that drought will actually be greater than its impact on soil moisture alone, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what we're looking at. And we're using satellite data to detect plant responses to that drought. And we're using a couple of different approaches based on satellite data. One is using, multispectral reflectance of vegetation observed from the satellite. And so basically, the reason that we use this is because leaves have a very distinct way that they interact with solar radiation. Basically, they absorb a lot of visible radiation, everything from blue through red light, because that's what they use for photosynthesis. So they're absorbing that light, but the mesophyll of leaves is very reflective of near infrared radiation. And so if you look at a healthy plant from space, what you see is really high reflectance of this near infrared radiation, but very low reflectance of visible radiation. Compare that to a plant that's not healthy, or to a place on the land surface that doesn't have much vegetation, and those types of radiation will all be reflected in roughly equal amounts. So you can detect how much vegetation is present and how healthy it is using just the way that it interacts with solar radiation, which is detected by the satellite. The other thing that we're using, which is a newer approach to monitoring vegetation health, is this thing called solar-induced fluorescence. Basically, when plants absorb light, some of that light gets used to drive photosynthesis, but not all of it. Plants actually re-emit light that they can't use, or they dissipate that light as heat. And the light that's emitted from a leaf is this thing called fluorescence. And it's something that's a very small proportion of the overall solar radiation budget, but it's still detectable from space, and it's directly tied to light use of the photosynthetic system. And so we can use that as an additional index of not just how much plant matter is there, how healthy is it, but what's the plant physiology doing. And so those are the two remotely sensed vegetation indices that we're using. So if you look at those and how they changed during that 2012 to 2015 drought, we can see that overall, the drought, which is shown here on the left, this is basically fraction of soil moisture relative to normal. So you can see very low soil moisture in the Central Valley in particular. And then these two maps on the right are showing the responsive vegetation. So generally, we see overall a reduction in vegetation health and productivity during that drought, with the exception of some of the mountainous regions where plants just aren't as limited by moisture. They're more limited by growing season length than anything else. But in a lot of the lower elevation, more arid parts of the West, you see this really, really strong reduction in vegetation health during the drought. And then the question is, how much of that is attributable to anthropogenic activity? That's what we want to figure out. We know that the vegetation health is reduced during drought. We want to know how much did humans contribute to that. So what we did is we took the observed climate data that we have for the region and basically decomposed it into natural variability and anthropogenic effects. And we do that using climate models. So in these figures, we're showing a few different climate variables, temperature, relative humidity, and precipitation, and how much of the observed variability was due to human effects. So in all of these graphs, the black line is showing the observations. So in this case, we're looking at soil moisture in this bottom left panel, panel G. And so you can see the variation of soil moisture in the observed record, and then how much of that was attributable to human activity. So for the most part, because precipitation is not really changing that much due to human activity, the effect of human activity on soil moisture is not super high. Over the past couple decades, you can see that human effect is increasing. The effect of human activity on temperature, which is shown in this upper panel, that's much greater. Almost all of the variation in temperature over the past century or so, long-term variation, is attributable to human activity. So those increases in temperature are very much a human-caused factor. But what we did is we basically took this climate data, including soil moisture, vapor pressure deficit, minimum temperature, maximum temperature, and solar radiation. And we did this decomposition into natural-driven variation and human-driven variation. And then using that, that decomposition of past climate, we basically modeled what the effects of those natural components and those anthropogenic components would be on the vegetation. And so kind of like our overall method is we're just fitting an empirical model between observed variation in vegetation, which is this delta veg up here. That's the observed anomaly in vegetation health. And we're modeling that as a function of anomalies in those 5 climate variables. And then, so this is like this is just an empirical model. Basically, we're just using ordinary least squares regression. We've got some lags built in because plants respond to climate, not just in the month that they're growing, but also in prior months. So there's kind of like this legacy built in. Since a lot of these predictors are correlated with each other, like minimum temperature and maximum temperature are very, very strongly correlated with each other. We did a PCA prior to building the model, and then just used the first components that were explaining 95% of the variance. So we're only using the first few principal components to kind of reflect the fact that these are not necessarily independent predictors. And then we fit models for both the overall region as a whole, the vegetation anomalies in the overall region, as well as for the different land cover types in the region. So this map on the right is showing basically the 4 main land cover types: forest, savanna, grassland, and shrubland. So we built models for the region as a whole, as well as for each of those individual land cover types. And then what we did is we used those empirical models, which are based on the observed anomalies in both climate and vegetation, and we systematically altered one variable at a time to allow detection of how much that vegetation anomaly is driven by the natural or anthropogenic effect. So in other words, we start by driving the model solely with natural factors, and then we add in the anthropogenic effect later to see what the difference is. And ultimately what we're looking for is the fraction of the variation in vegetation health that's attributable to the anthropogenic effect. And so this equation, which looks kind of messy, is basically just saying in the numerator, this is the vegetation anomaly that's attributable to natural variability. And then in the denominator, this is the total vegetation anomaly. So that fraction represents the fraction of the vegetation anomaly that occurred that's attributable to natural effects, and then the anthropogenic effect would be 1 minus that natural effect. So in addition to doing this kind of like overall how much of the variation in vegetation was attributable to human effects, we also did it for each individual variable: temperature, soil moisture, vapor pressure deficit. So we can attribute the vegetation anomaly to each of those individual proximate causes of reduction in vegetation health. So that's kind of the overall approach that we were taking in this project. And so now I'm going to show some of the results for that. So this is showing during the course of the drought, variation in that solar-induced fluorescence metric, which again is basically you can think of as a proxy for photosynthesis. And the light blue in these graphs is showing change due to natural effects, and then the dark blue is showing change due to anthropogenic effects. In a lot of these land cover types like forest, there actually wasn't that much change due to the drought. Again, that's because like forests, for example, are growing at higher elevations where they're less constrained by water. But where we really see fairly strong anthropogenic effects are in shrublands in particular. So we see roughly a 65% change, well, about 65% of the change in that shrubland productivity was directly attributable to warmer temperatures and higher vapor pressure deficit. For grasslands and savannas, the percent that's attributable to human activity is a little bit less, and the effects of the drought were also a little bit less. Where we really see the strongest effects are in the shrublands, which I don't think is terribly surprising because shrublands in the Southwest are very much dependent on soil moisture. They're very tightly coupled to water availability. For the reflectance-based metrics of vegetation health, which are more related to how much leaf matter is on the ground, we see similar patterns overall, though the anthropogenic effect tends to be a little bit less. And I think, I'm trying to figure out exactly why this is. I think what it's saying is that vegetation structure is not responding as strongly to temperature and vapor pressure deficit. Maybe because it doesn't have time to necessarily, because vegetation structure is something that's got a lot of lag built into it. It's you don't have plants immediately dying as soon as there's a drought. They kind of persist, at least for a while. But the physiology, which is what the previous index was showing, that responds basically immediately. So I think that's what the difference is here. But largely what we see is kind of similar patterns overall, reductions in overall vegetation health, some of which is due to anthropogenic activity, but more of the vegetation health loss, at least by these metrics, tends to be a result of natural variability more than anything else. And then this is just like one other metric showing basically the same thing. This is also based on those more reflectance-based remotely sensed indicators. So overall, we see reductions in vegetation health during the drought, roughly 30 to 60% of which is due to anthropogenic warming. When we look at the proximate factors that are driving that, there's a few key takeaways. So this graph now is showing on the y-axis the proportion of the total vegetation health loss that's attributable to natural effects, which is going to be the bar on the left of each of these panels, and to human effects, which is the bar on the right. And I think there's a few key takeaways here. The first is that the biggest single driver of lost vegetation health during drought is natural variability in soil moisture. I don't think that's surprising. Like I said earlier, most of the impact or most of the thing that causes these droughts is natural variability in precipitation. And so that's the single biggest factor that's affecting plant growth. But what's remarkable is how much that's enhanced by human activity. And so if we look at these bars on the right, this again is the overall effect of human activity on vegetation health loss. And so for the region as a whole, about 50% of the lost vegetation health, at least according to that fluorescence metric, was due to anthropogenic warming. About 10% of that was attributable to anthropogenic effects on soil moisture, but the rest, these three top colored bars here, the gray, that light orange, and that dark orange, those are the effects coming from anthropogenic increases in temperature and vapor pressure deficit. And so what we can see pretty clearly is that for the region as a whole, especially for shrublands, the drought effects on vegetation were significantly enhanced, roughly doubled, compared to what they would have been if in the absence of warming. So that's kind of the overall message there. We've been doing this for the most recent drought too, the 2020 drought, with very similar results. This is showing for 4 different sites, and this is not based on remote sensing data. This is based on actual ground measurements of productivity. And we see basically the same thing. We can't do the anthropogenic attribution here because the end of the 2020 year is too new to have done all of the work to decompose the climate. But what we can say is that most of the lost photosynthesis at these sites was due to reduced soil moisture, which is shown in these kind of green bars. But that loss due to soil moisture was enhanced significantly in a lot of cases by increases in vapor pressure deficit. And that increase in vapor pressure deficit, that's largely an anthropogenic effect. So we're fairly confident that that the lost vegetation health during these recent hot droughts, global change type droughts, that change in vegetation health is very strongly amplified by these anthropogenic effects. So to kind of summarize what we found that anthropogenic climate change roughly doubled, depends on the ecosystem, depends on what metric of health you're using, but in most cases, it roughly doubled the impacts of the 2012 to 2015 drought on vegetation health compared to what would have been expected due solely to natural variability. And in particular, that change, that anthropogenic enhancement is largely due to increases in vapor pressure deficit, that demand of the atmosphere for moisture. So kind of the big picture takeaway from this research, I think, is that even if precipitation doesn't change, which most of the projections say it's not going to change a ton, or at least there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction and magnitude of that change. But even if precipitation doesn't change, warming alone will increase the risk and severity of drought, and it will likely really increase the effects of that those droughts have on vegetation. And so with that, I will take questions.
Hey, Matt, this is Tom. Great presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Most of this seems to be focused on the Southwest.
Yeah.
What does this say for Iowa? What's it look like?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So that's something, you know, I might have to come back and do another presentation sometime. But that's a great question. So one of the other consequences of this increase in saturation vapor pressure with warming, the increase in like that atmospheric sponge for moisture, basically one of the consequences is that will tend to enhance, in addition to enhancing vapor pressure deficit, it will enhance precipitation variability. Basically, if you have a bigger atmospheric sponge, when you wring that sponge out, you get a bigger downpour, right? But it also takes more water to fill that sponge in the first place. So you tend to get larger downpours punctuated or separated by longer dry periods. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we see here in Iowa. We see very clearly an increase in precipitation variability, especially in spring and summer. And for a lot of the tree species that occur here, especially bur oak, which is our state tree, that increase in precipitation variability is not a good thing. It basically means that they have to kind of hold their breath sort of for longer periods of time, but then when they get those downpours, that excess moisture isn't really benefiting them that much. In some cases, it might even hurt them if it benefits pests and pathogens that hurt them. And so what we've seen, at least using some tree ring data in a recent study, is that that increase in precipitation variability, which again is largely an expectation of this, this change in temperature, has pretty negative consequences for a lot of Iowa's ecosystems. And next summer, we're actually going to be doing some experimental work as part of a project funded by the Office of Sustainability to systematically manipulate how much precipitation bur oak is getting just in a few saplings, and then monitoring the physiological responses. So hopefully in a year or so, I'll be able to give you a more detailed answer. Thanks for the question.
Can you tell us about the impact of irrigation with all this? I mean, California in particular with the Central Valley, they rely on that massively. I'm not saying we're going to irrigate forest and shrubland, but does it have any impact on what you're observing in terms of soil moisture? Or do they irrigate just enough that it's holding the fields? Does it reach outside into more natural areas? I mean, does it have any impact at all?
That's a great question. So we deliberately excluded human modified land from this precisely for that reason. Because like you're saying, if you irrigate it, that's kind of offsetting the deficit of precipitation and mitigating that drought. So I don't know exactly what we could say about that, except that I would expect that, there might be more demand for irrigation if you have to counteract that increase in temperature and that increase in vapor pressure deficit.
Thank you.
This is,
yeah, thanks for the question.
It's such an interesting presentation, Matt. This kind of follows on the question you were just asked. I mean, so apart from, oh, we have to stop warming the climate, what are the are you seeing any policy implications about this related to adaptation or that sort of thing?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the biggest message that I've gotten from doing drought research is that, because of the scale of the problem, it's really hard to manage that on the ground absent increasing irrigation or something like that. So to me, like the biggest policy message that I've gotten from this, and again, I'm not like a policy person, so I don't want to step too far like outside of my lane here.
Oh
but
no,
like,
we want you to step out of the policy. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like the biggest thing is just mitigating the effects of climate change. Basically, that I think is gonna have the biggest implication. I think there probably are some forest management techniques that could mitigate the effects on like forest productivity. That's not entirely my area, but there are definitely things that can be done to like manage forests more sustainably, specifically with this type of change in mind. So that's what I would say. There's some combination of climate change mitigation and forest management is kind of the solution.
So I had a question about the signal when you look across intact landscapes and managed landscapes and left to go unmanaged or loosely managed fire managed landscapes. Is there a signal across those? And for adaptation, is it better to manage the landscape to be climate adapted, or leave or preserve intact ecosystems that are going to be better at handling this? What is there something about land management that is an obvious signal in your data in any of the regions that you've studied?
So we didn't really dig into that. That's something that that's like very much on the table for what we're doing with the next steps for particularly this 2020 drought project, where we're planning to dig into that a little bit more and see, what's causing some of the variation on like a geographic level in both the impact that drought has, but also its sensitivity to warming. So I can't answer that yet, I don't think, mostly because I haven't dug into it yet. It is something that we're planning to do though. As far as to your second question, which was about, what was the question? Like active management versus kind of maintaining existing forest health. Is that right? Is that right?
Well, basically, active management and trying to do something or anything versus unmanaged Western ecosystems.
Ooh, good question. That's a great question. I don't entirely know the answer to it either, honestly. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. I don't have a great answer for that one.
So
I don't know.
We can think about how we can look into it, but I think it is especially interesting because if these issues arise from trying to manage and it's not working, then that's an interesting signal to land managers.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree. That would be super interesting and useful. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't. I think that's the kind of thing, though, that we could answer using information on like what kind of management is happening on the ground and linking that to this kind of geographic signal that we're getting from the satellite data. I think it's totally answerable. I just don't have the answer now. Good question, though. I'm going to think more about that.
This is not a good question. This is an ignorance question. on one of your slides, you said with regard to a couple of the items, I think it was Savannah and something else, I can't remember, that the model lacked skill.
Yeah.
And I'm just ignorant as to exactly what that means. I can guess. But so the one question is, what does that mean? And the second question is, was that true of the model even in the subsequent slides when you continued to show the impact on Savannah and other things? Is it still true that the model lacked skill, whatever that, as I say, whatever that means exactly?
That is a good question. I had a slide in here that was showing that a little bit more clearly, and then I cut it because I thought I was going to be over time. So I'm glad that you asked it so that I can answer. What I mean by that is like this whole approach revolves around having a decent empirical model of how climate variability is linked to the vegetation anomalies. In some cases, that model just doesn't work that well. And it's largely a function of how coupled is that ecosystem to climate variability. So for grasslands and shrublands, the empirical models work really well because those systems are so strongly coupled to moisture availability that an anomaly in soil moisture or vapor pressure deficit gets pretty easily translated into an anomaly in the vegetation activity. For the forests and savannas in particular, it wasn't as clear a link. And so those models just didn't perform as well, basically. In other words, I mean that like a climate-only model just can't really explain as easily what the vegetation is doing because the vegetation is not as strongly coupled to climate. That's part of it. The other part is the other part of the reason that some of the models are more skillful than others has to do with the index that we're using of plant activity. That fluorescence index in particular, the signal that the satellite sees is really low because it's just such a small part of the radiation budget that it's a little bit harder to pick out the signal from the noise, basically, in that index. And so the models that are based on the solar induced fluorescence metric tend to be a little bit worse than the ones that are based on those other more reflectance-based metrics. And the models for the ecosystems that are not as strongly or tightly coupled to climate tend to be a little bit worse. So for the slides that I showed later, what I was mostly emphasizing is where we have the most confidence, which is in shrublands and grasslands, and in particular when we're looking at these more reflectance greenness-based indices. Any other questions?
How much role does recent fires have in your data, and what did you have to do to address the role of fire a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? And does it have a signal?
That's a good question. So we did not try to get into the fire side of things. We were basically saying that we were kind of lumping in the fire signal with the rest of the vegetation anomaly signal. I think that's a great question, though. Park, who's one of the collaborators, Park Williams, he's like an internationally renowned expert on the effects of climate change on fire. And he's done some work looking specifically at how much anthropogenic warming affects fire in the West. And so like he would be the person I would defer to on that. But kind of the message from a lot of his work is the same as the message here, I think, that fire depends on the aridity of the fuel, and that vapor pressure deficit, the increases in vapor pressure deficit due to warming substantially increase the aridity of that fuel. In the case that we're doing here, we're kind of lumping those together. I think we could separate it though, using like remotely sensed fire boundaries or something like that to try to tease out how much of this is a physiological response, how much of it is a structural response coming from just like the fact that you lost all your vegetation, something like that.
Am I off when I'm kind of seeing good news? Like,
What's that?
let me, I think I'm thinking I saw good news, I think, but tell me if I'm off, right? That plants are actually more resilient. If it was only temperature, it would be quite different than if it's temperature and humidity combined, right? Does it mean that if we do everything we can, if we stop all emissions today, right? Am I reading that things would actually go back quicker than we think in terms of plant life?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would say that the danger is that we're pushing plants into a world that they're not really well adapted for, or that they haven't really experienced in the recent past, at least. I think you're right that, you know, if we were to mitigate climate change, do what we can to reduce the warming effect, then the danger goes down a lot, because they are well adapted to precipitation variability. They've experienced a really wide range of precipitation regimes. And so I think you're correct that, you know, with strong mitigation, there is some good news there. The other piece of good news, which we didn't really get into, is that CO2, higher CO2 has a direct physiological impact on plants as well. Basically, when you have higher CO2, plants can close their stomates to prevent water loss, but still take up an equivalent amount of CO2 for photosynthesis. So some of that would offset this effect as well, potentially. So there's maybe a couple pieces of good news.
Any other questions for Matt? All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you especially to Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Matt.
And thanks for the great questions.